Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
Policy making is the backbone of effective governance, playing a pivotal role in shaping the trajectory of a nation. It serves as the blueprint for addressing societal challenges, promoting economic growth and ensuring the well-being of citizens. Well-crafted policies not only address current issues, but also anticipate future challenges, contributing to the long-term success and resilience of a political system. In essence, policy making is the linchpin that transforms political ideologies into tangible actions, fostering a harmonious and progressive society. This week marks the 10th anniversary of the founding of one of Wales's leading foremost policy institutions, the Welsh Centre for Public Policy. The Centre provides public service leaders and policymakers with authoritative, independent evidence that helps them tackle the economic, social and environmental challenges facing Wales. Part of what we at Hiraeth try and do is shine a light on the policy work undertaken in Wales, and joining us today to talk all things policy and celebrate 10 years of the Wales Centre for Public Policy are Professor Steve Martin. Steve is the Director of the Wales Centre for Public Policy and Professor of Public Policy and Management at Cardiff University, having led the Centre as Director since its establishment a decade ago. Afternoon, Steve.
Hi, nice to see you, Kerry.
We're also joined by Dan Bristow. Dan is Director of Policy and Practice for the Centre, with a particular responsibility for knowledge, mobilisation and capacity building.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And finally, Amanda Hill-Dixon. Amanda is the Senior Research Fellow leading on tackling inequalities for the Centre. Good afternoon, Amanda.
Good afternoon, Kerry. Nice to meet you.
And you, thank you. Well, as I put in the introduction, and to those who listen regularly will know that policy is very much my focus for the pod, and I've worked with the Centre in the past, and I've always been very, very impressed. Steve, can you kick us off and just give us a little bit about the background to the Centre, why it was formed, and where it's gone over the past decade?
Initially, we were funded by the Welsh Government to work exclusively with ministers to help them to identify issues where they felt they would benefit from having access to external evidence and expertise, to work alongside the civil service in thinking about the policy options around those issues. So that was initially where we started, Dan and I and one other colleague, 3-person team based in Cardiff University, providing a sort of gateway for ministers to expertise around the world. That was the plan. What we found was that we grew quite rapidly, and now there's nearly 30 of us, so that's a 10-fold increase, is it? Which I never really anticipated, but that's happened as there's been much more demand for the work that we've been doing than I think anyone anticipated, including the then First Minister. And our role has expanded to include not just Wales, but public services and Wales, local government, public bodies, PSPs, and others.
Dan, you're the current Director of Policy and Practice. Can you talk us through why good policy making is so important for society?
So, as you said in your intro, policy is the thing that connects political ambition to change in society. So it's the way in which governments think about how they enact the change that they either stood on in the election or that they want to achieve because political pressures and societal pressures have encouraged them to try and bring about change. People tend to think of it as being laws or government budgets, but actually it's a much broader set of tools that government can use. What government chooses to give its attention to ends up driving change, or can end up driving change in society. So policy should be thought of as the broad range of things that governments can do to try and bring about change. And where it goes wrong, where it goes badly, that's easier to identify than when it goes well. So, I mean, a recent example of it going badly wrong was with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and the mini budget, and the impact was almost immediate in terms of the impact on the cost of government borrowing and the cost of household borrowing. So that was a dramatic example of it going wrong. And then in terms of things going right, I mean, in Wales we've seen one of the ones that is always heralded as a success in Wales is the levy on plastic bags, and that's driven changes in behaviours in Wales. And actually, more broadly, Wales has a really positive story to tell on recycling rates and waste, and that's because governments have invested time, energy, resource in trying to address that. So that maybe two examples. One more positive than the other in terms of policy and the ways in which government try and bring about change.
I don't know if that was happen chance or whether you did that to butter me up, but if you mention the carrier bag levy on this pod, you're definitely going to get something free in the post now. Rich, can we arrange that, please? As we mentioned earlier, that's exactly what my master's dissertation was looking at, which Steve was involved with. But Amanda, before I get to go on about single-use carrier bags too much, can you talk us through how the centre works now? You know, what are the processes for those who want to engage your services in terms of what you can do for them and making that kind of policy interaction?
So as you'll probably have gathered, we're an independent research centre based at Cardiff University, and we exist to provide Welsh Government and Welsh Public Services with accessible, timely, robust evidence and expertise to inform and support policy making and practice in Wales. We also have a team of academic researchers who study the sort of politics and practice of evidence-informed policy and work with us to reflect on and improve our impact. So in terms of the Welsh Government and public service work, the way we work with the Welsh Government, well, the way we work with all of our partners in the public sector is that, unlike a lot of sort of traditional academics and academic departments, we take a demand-led approach to all of our work, which means that it's the priorities and challenges facing policymakers and practitioners which is a kind of key determinant of what we work on. So with the Welsh Government, we have, over the last 10 years, developed a process whereby the Welsh Government source and invite civil servants, ministers, SPADs from across the civil service to suggest policy challenges that we could support them on. So a long list of potential policy challenges and projects is developed, and that's whittled down to a short list, which we then agree and take forwards. And those projects can be across many different policy areas and have ranged from, 20 miles per hour speed limits to informing kind of flagship policies like the anti-racist Wales Action Plan. And then on our public services, with our public services work, obviously there's no single organisation which we could liaise with to understand their demand. So it's not as straightforward a process. So with public services, the way that we decide what to work on and understand the demand in relation to evidence is that we draw on kind of three key sources of insight. So we do talk directly with and read key documents from policymakers and practitioners in public services and local government. So, for example, the Public Service Board wellbeing plans are a key source for us. We also look at the sort of evidence base in terms of understanding what evidence is available to mobilise in relation to key policy challenges facing public services. And also to understand what the evidence suggests are the key policy challenges facing Wales. And then we also kind of draw on our own internal knowledge and insight based on all of our work and all of our interactions with evidence users and the evidence base and academics. So we've been through that process with public services over the last 6 months or so at the outset of our sort of next decade. And through that process, we've identified 3 key priority areas to focus our work on, which are inequalities, which I lead on, community wellbeing, and environment and net zero.
That's great. I think we're going to explore those in a little while. But before we get there, thank you for that introduction. And I've certainly benefited from going through that process. And I know when I was a civil servant, if we had the work you were working on and you had the support of the centre or the budget to get the support of the centre, it was certainly a plus and certainly helped me out on a number of policy areas. Steve, you've been there since the start, and I read that it's been over 200 projects undertaken to date. What are the policies that the centre has worked on that have made the biggest impact in those 10 years, do you think?
It's a great question. It's like being asked which is your favourite child, isn't it? And I'm at risk of upsetting colleagues by not choosing projects which they've led. Can I give you 3 or 4? Because they illustrate different things about the way in which we work, I think, and the benefit that I think evidence brings to policy making. Dan, I pinched this sort of categorization from Dan, but he observed a long while ago that we get asked different types of question by ministers, by local government leaders and others, and sometimes those questions lead one into the other. But we often get asked, can you analyse for us the nature of this problem, this challenge? Is it actually a problem? What's going on? Who's at the sharp end of it? That sort of question. So understanding the issue. Secondly, we often then get asked, so if it is a problem in Wales, then what can I do about it? What have others done elsewhere? Sometimes we get asked, I've already decided this is what I'm going to do. What's the best way to achieve it? And sometimes we get asked, if I did this, then what might happen? So a sort of modelling type question, looking into the future and saying, this is the likely outcome of adopting that policy in that particular way here in Wales. So just to give some examples of that, we did a lot of work around the impact of Brexit, as you'd expect. Big surprise to many of us in Wales, the way that referendum went. Not a lot of prior thought probably gone into preparing for what that would mean for Wales. We were brought in to look at things like what will be the impact of changing migration rules on the Welsh workforce, particularly the NHS workforce, but other sectors as well, which relied on skilled workers from the EU to come in. We did a lot of work on what would be the impact on household incomes. We looked at impact on farming policy and on fisheries policy. So helping Welsh policymakers to access and work with people who are really expert in this area, had already been thinking about it and working on it in a way in which many of us hadn't. That's one kind of impact. And that work was reflected in the Welsh Government's white paper on EU transition. Our work was put in there as an annex and so on. So there were a number of different ways in which we helped the civil service and ministers to think through the Welsh response to Brexit transition. A very different example, we got asked to look at youth homelessness in Wales and what could actually be done about that. And we worked with a group of Canadian experts from the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, plus Llamai and Welsh local government. So we brought together international expertise, experience from somewhere completely different in the world, working with people who completely understand the context and the issue here in Wales. And that led to a pilot which the then housing minister introduced to look at innovative ways of addressing the youth homelessness problem. It also meant that we went to the Economic and Social Research Council and said, we think there's a big value in more academic research on this topic. They very kindly gave us some funding, which we then used to fund a study at Cambridge University on what happens to care leavers who fall into the homelessness trap and how might we address that. So a bundle of things going on there, international expertise, local knowledge and expertise, a Welsh pilot, and further research to fill in the gaps in the knowledge that we found. I'll give you a couple more if there's time. Free childcare. Welsh Government was working on a free childcare offer many years ago, asked us to model the impact of that on poverty rates and on parental likelihood of returning to work, particularly mothers. And the scheme that they'd devised, we modelled the impact of that with experts in a consultancy in London, Frontier Economics, wasn't it? And what they found was, which we then reported back to a slightly perplexed then First Minister, that narrows it down to 2, well, it was the previous one, that the scheme that the Welsh Government had in mind was going to be difficult for parents to actually return to work because it was only providing cover during school term times, and most jobs don't stop in school holidays. And secondly, it was going to likely have an impact on people's benefits. So what will be happening is Welsh Government would be subsidising free childcare. UK Government would then be saving on its benefits bill, which wasn't really what any of us, including Welsh Government, had in mind. So that was an impact where we said this probably isn't quite the right way to tackle this particular policy, and there was a bit of a rethink and a different kind of offer made. And then finally, I'm very proud of the work that we've done on loneliness and social isolation, particularly lucky that we started that before the pandemic. So it became a huge issue during the pandemic. It was something that we were already working on. So the stars aligned for us a bit there. But we started by analysing the nature of the problem. It's a problem for all sorts of public services, but it's not anybody's primary responsibility to tackle loneliness. So we brought together the evidence on who's lonely in Wales, and that produced some sort of counterintuitive findings. It wasn't just older people living alone. Probably the loneliest cohort in Wales are groups of young people, actually. Then we started to work with the third sector, with Welsh Government, with local authorities, with something called the Welsh Centre for Wellbeing and others, and some senior experts in academia on loneliness. And we've developed then a whole programme of work on how do you tackle this question of loneliness and social isolation. Can you use digital tools? Is it about activating the community and local initiatives? The answer's yes and yes. And then what can we learn more generally about community wellbeing and supporting communities to be able to look after themselves more effectively? And that's what's then led into the work that Amanda referred to, which we're now doing around community wellbeing.
I think we're going to come into that, and that's really interesting. With a couple of organisations I work with different hats on that, addressing loneliness, I think, has benefited from some of the work of the centre. It's certainly something we put in a lot of our kind of plans and strategies. But Dan, what I want to do now, Steve has given us through a brief summary of all that work over the past 10 years. But we're looking to the future now, and this week is that celebration of the Public Policy Centre at 10. Can you talk us through how you're celebrating? You've got a publication which is coming out later this week, haven't you?
That's right. Yeah, we thought, reaching double digits, we should mark the occasion. And so we've put together a publication that partly is about thanking our funders and our collaborators, but then to emphasize really that we're keen to play our part in facing the challenges that society currently faces in Wales. We know we do our best work when we have good quality collaboration with partners. That means that we are supporting them to achieve positive change in the world. So we strongly believe that decisions based on evidence are better decisions. And we know that the evidence doesn't speak for itself. So it needs to be considered alongside the local environment, what local people want, the politics of the situation. And we see our role as bringing together those collaborating partners, bringing the evidence and expertise in particular into that conversation, and working together to think about what might be done in light of this. And so we wanted to use the publication partly as a way of saying, this is how we want to work. And these are the issues that we see, not because we've sat in Cardiff University by ourselves pontificating on the kinds of things that are facing the world, but based, as Amanda said earlier, on the documents that people are producing around their priorities, the conversations that we're already having, and the fact that we've been around for 10 years and have a sense of what's happening in Wales by virtue of the relationships and networks that we've built over that time. And we wanted to emphasize the fact that the work that we do, we see it very much as based on kind of those relationships, building relationships where we don't have them, or using the relationships where we do, because as people will know from their own personal lives, you're more likely to listen to someone that you trust. And whether that's an institution or an individual, if you trust someone, you're more likely to take on board what they're saying about how you might behave and how you might behave differently. And the same is true for governments, because governments and any organization is, at its heart, it's the people, right? So we know we need those good quality relationships in order to be able to collaborate effectively with partners. And so what we're trying to do with the publication is say, this is how we see the world, please come and work with us. And we've identified the 3 priority areas that Amanda has highlighted. And actually those 3 areas, tackling inequalities, addressing environmental and climatic change challenges, so environment and net zero, we call that one, and community wellbeing, which has been increasingly focused on community mobilization and how do you partner with communities. We see those as being the things where we think we can add value, and those things obviously interact with each other, right? So if you want to do something about tackling climate change, it's not something governments can do by themselves. Local government, national government, you need to work with local communities. And you need to do that in a way that's cognizant of the fact that they are facing fundamental challenges driven by cost of living and other pressures. So we're trying to think about how we draw those things together more.
No, that's great. And those three areas which both Amanda and yourself have identified, they're really my policy drivers. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this bit now. Amanda, are you able to talk us through the areas that you've got responsibility for as you look at those kind of priorities over the next 18 months and further forward? I think you mentioned tackling inequalities as one of yours.
Yeah, sure. So that's right. I lead our work on tackling inequalities for Welsh Government and public services. In that work, we take quite a broad concept of inequalities to include poverty and sort of material hardship, which obviously has been quite an acute and persistent and growing policy challenge in Wales, with, as you're probably familiar, sort of around 1 in 3 children experiencing poverty, relative income poverty in Wales. And that's been persistent for some time. So there's the kind of poverty dimension to it, the sort of social and cultural dimensions that are connected to that. But then also we really recognise that there's a strong kind of place-based dimension to poverty. You know, as soon as you start inequality, as soon as you start travelling around Wales, you immediately see the place-based inequalities that exist across the country. And then also in our work, we recognise and often work on systemic inequalities in the sense of the protected characteristics that individuals or households might have that make it often more likely that they will experience different forms of inequality and poverty. So be it in terms of kind of race and ethnicity, disability, gender. So our work touches upon those kind of diverse and varied forms of inequality. In recent years, since I've been at the centre, some of the key pieces of work we've done for the Welsh Government have been multidimensional evidence review to inform the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. So that covered sort of 5 policy areas: health, education, criminal justice, leadership, and one other that I can't quite remember. And so that's kind of directly informed the action plan and the policy as it's being developed and now is being implemented. And then also a big piece of work to conduct an international evidence review of kind of what works to tackle poverty across 12 different dimensions, and drawing on kind of existing and new lived experience evidence to create a piece of work that could inform the refreshed child poverty strategy, which has just been consulted on and finalised, I think. Yeah, we also support the Welsh Government on other kind of inequalities related policy challenges and projects such as diversity in public appointments, free school meals and more. In terms of our work with public services, we've been going through a process over the last 6 months to understand what are the key inequalities challenges facing local government and public services in Wales. And we've identified kind of a handful of potential projects which we may take forwards. The one that's most advanced at the moment is related to poverty stigma. One of the key insights that we gained from the lived experience evidence and input was around kind of consistent experiences of stigma that people who are experiencing poverty often face. And that's kind of a form of suffering in its own right, but it also affects and limits people's ability and willingness to seek support or participate in their communities. Partly as a result of that work, the new Welsh Government Child Poverty Strategy now acknowledges the importance of kind of tackling stigma through its work and public services work as key to tackling poverty. And we're now running a programme of work for public services to support them to better understand and tackle poverty stigma. So that's kind of a bit of a summary of where we are with our inequalities work at the moment. And I think Dan's probably best placed to tell you where we are with our community wellbeing and environment and net zero work.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are 2 areas that are led on by colleagues of ours, but I will attempt to give you an overview of their work. Where I'll start is with the environment and net zero work. We've a few years ago now became interested in the idea of the intersection between tackling climate change, but doing that alongside trying to address inequalities. So how do you tackle climate change and bring about the structural changes that we need in society while not further deepening the inequalities that we already see? And how do you do that in a way that you're using your economic growth and development agenda in order to meet those dual aims at the same time, and started to talk about a just transition, which is then led to a series of pieces of work that we've done looking at what is a just transition, how have other countries used that concept and operationalized that concept, in Wales, how can we use the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act as a way of pursuing a just transition in Wales, but then also looking at aspects of the skills agenda as well. So what kinds of skills are needed for the future? How do you support people to transition from work and from jobs that are likely to need to change or maybe even disappear, and to develop the skills that they might need for the jobs that we are likely to need in the future as we see the structural changes that we need? A lot of our work over the last year, I'd say, has been about supporting the group that James Davidson is chairing on behalf of the Welsh Government. The Welsh Government, as part of the cooperation agreement with Plaid, have set up a group, a challenge group they're calling it, to see what can be done to accelerate efforts to decarbonise. And so we've been working with that group to try and bring together the evidence base to support some of the discussions they've been having, both within the group, but then with partners and other stakeholders within Wales, about what could be done, within Wales and by the Welsh Government in particular, to accelerate efforts to decarbonisation. That's where I certainly see an intersection between the inequalities work, the environment and net zero work, but then also our communities work, because one of the things that comes through really strongly if you engage with any of the evidence around climate change is that we actually all need to be pulling in the same direction. One of the things that struck me really early on from participating in an early group conversation was someone was reflecting that there's quite a kind of groundswell of, enthusiasm is not the quite the right word, but I guess there's motivation within the population to try and do something to tackle climate change. And there's a sense of urgency, but not a sense of agency. So you have lots of people who would be really keen to try and do something. They just don't know what that thing is. And kind of small scale but important efforts like recycling feel like they're not commensurate to the challenges that we face. And yet, trying to do something about the energy efficiency of your house, or trying to change your travel behaviors, or trying to eat differently, you're kind of left as an individual to try and grapple with that yourself. So I see the kind of one of the challenges that government's got in terms of, and it's not just Welsh Government, but governments writ large have got in terms of trying to tackle climate change, is how do you tap into that? How do you unleash that kind of desire to kind of help and make a change? And in the community wellbeing work that we've done, that's one of the areas that we've been working on most recently, is looking at what can we learn from the pandemic. There was a kind of a groundswell of community activism through the pandemic to try and support. People were supporting each other in a way that we hadn't seen prior to the pandemic, and in the same kind of scale. What can we learn from that? How did that come about, and how do we hold on to that? How do we hold on to that sense of collective endeavour? And we're coming to the end now of a review of academic evidence, experience during the pandemic, experience from the third sector, who were at the kind of front end of that experience during the pandemic. How do we kind of crystallize that and then share that with decision makers of, if you're interested in doing this, which I think a lot of people are, how do you do it well? And how do you not fall into traps that are easily fallen into in terms of it being tokenistic or excluding some communities, not necessarily intentionally, but by design, you kind of rule out certain communities participating. But that particular piece of work has built on a suite of projects, some of which Steve mentioned earlier, which started in a place of loneliness and social isolation. And there's been a series of pieces of work that built on each other. And this latest piece is, as I say, particularly around community mobilisation.
I think there's a lot there for those of us who are still working public policy and have got personal and professional interest in this to watch out for, not just these immediate pieces of work you're undertaking, but what you're looking to over the next 2, 3, 4 years going forward. And I'm sure the pod, as things come out, will be interested in perhaps picking up and focusing on some of those. But I want to turn now to what the kind of Wales-based policy field is like. And in the last few months, I don't know if anyone's been watching the COVID inquiry, what they're looking at was an incredibly difficult, pressurized period of governance and policy, but it has highlighted a number of weaknesses, perhaps at both the elected members' level of knowledge and experience and at policy development levels. I think it was highlighted the science capabilities of civil servants in Whitehall in a recent session with Chris Whitty, I think it was. Wales, it's not always done by trained experts in these kind of policy areas. Steve, where would you say our policy-making capacities are in Wales? Are we generally quite robust, or is there more we could do?
Can the answer be both? I think patchy might be a fair answer. That seems to apply to much of the public policy landscape in Wales. There are things we do really well, and there are things that we don't do so well and could improve on. In some senses, I think the role that we have shows the lack of time and headspace which the civil service and policy officers in local government and elsewhere actually have these days to engage with the evidence base. So part of what we're trying to do is to bridge that gap between the very different worlds of policy making on the one hand and academic research on the other, which operate to completely different timescales, have different ways of thinking, often even have different kind of languages to some of the stuff that my academic colleagues write behind journal paywalls. Can't be accessed if you're interested in reading it as a civil servant. And if you did access it, it probably wouldn't be speaking to the immediate challenges that you have. So I do think there's an issue about the disaggregation of the policy system and the need to bring it together through people like us who call ourselves evidence intermediaries, I suppose, and try and make those connections. We're also finding that for all of Wales's benefits around being a small country with a fairly close-knit policy community, and they're very real. I mean, I've worked with Whitehall departments which feel very, very different to the kind of policy landscape we have here. But often we're still working in silos within local and national government, central government. We still got people who are tasked with looking at a challenge through the perspective of one policy area, even though we know that often all of these things are interconnected and cross-cutting. So I think there's a lot more that we could still do to join up policy making, but we've been talking about that for decades, and it's not an easy thing to do, but it requires thinking about the training that people have, the experience that people have, whether they can move more easily between, say, Welsh government and local government, the health service and the other sectors, whether there's scope for people moving more easily between the worlds of research and policy making and practice. All of those things are not unique to Wales, but they're all areas which I think we need to continue to work at. And it becomes really difficult in an environment where there's no money and we've got massive challenges on our hands and a sense of kind of ongoing multifaceted policy crises. So I'm not naive about it, but I think there are things that we could continue to work at.
So your question, Kerry, about, do people have the right skills? Do we have the right skills within government? The skill set you need will change depending on the challenge you face. The trick is to know how to bring in the right people at the right time and how to listen to them. I mean, that's, I think, the other thing that's coming through from the COVID inquiry is when do you listen to and how do you listen to experts and how do you engage with experts? And that really is a skill, that kind of understanding of, okay, as a politician, what's my role? I'm not going to be an expert on stuff, but how do I collaborate with experts so that I can make the best possible judgment that is ultimately a political judgment? And I think some of that, the COVID inquiry is flagging as an area of, or at least if it was lacking somewhat, shall we say.
What I've seen since I started working in policy in Wales is that we can sometimes be really good at producing policies that are really kind of supported and have a lot of engagement with. So, for example, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, is there's a lot of support for it in Wales, and internationally it's kind of held up as a really good example of ambitious and visionary policy making. But then there's also the key question of sort of implementation capacity and capability, and so whether the policies that have been designed and created can actually create the change on the ground that they that they aspire to create, that's a key part of the equation. And I think something that that is something that we can work on in Wales, as in most countries and governments.
Yeah, no, I think you're touching on points that we've regularly feature in the podcast. Actually, but it's about that kind of delivery capacity, and you all mention a lot of the buzzwords which we talk around silos, upskilling, things like that. And I think that's something I want to explore a little bit, because Steve, you and I first met when I did the Masters of Public Administration course at Cardiff University. I graduated a decade ago as well, actually. So I thought that was a fantastic initiative, and everything behind that was around upskilling Welsh policymakers across the public sector and wider afield. And it served me incredibly well over the past decade, working inside government and with various policy bodies outside. I'm not sure whether that scheme is still going. I don't think that particular course is. But do you think there's that need for our education establishments to, be providing such courses, both for policymakers, but I'm going to come on to something around our elected members as well?
Yeah, it's kind of you to name check the Master of Public Administration. I really enjoyed teaching is almost not the right word, leading that. I don't know what your experience was, but I always felt the most valuable thing was that one of my academic colleagues would provide a sort of starter for 10, a bit of a framework for thinking about an issue, maybe some evidence about how it's being approached. But the real learning came from you and the others around the table in talking to each other from different parts of the Welsh Public Service. And it was an education for me, which has stood me in good stead too. So that says to me that there certainly is a role for those kind of structured academic, for want of a better word, but very applied and policy-oriented courses. And of course, I'd like to see Welsh universities and other universities doing much more of that, and perhaps worrying a little bit less about have we got 25 people who can somehow scrape together the fees to come on this course, and see it as a bit of our kind of civic mission from within higher education. That would be fantastic. Though I know that if our VC was listening, she'd be saying, yeah, but we can't just provide courses for nothing. So yes, and I think there are a whole load of other ways of providing those kind of interactions, which I think were the real value in that MPA course and other post-experience courses that the university runs. And there's been a very successful course in this building where I am now in recent months called Infuse, run by some of our colleagues in ERLab. So we're still doing those sorts of things. But I think creating space where people can come together and talk in an honest and open and safe sort of way about the policy challenges they're facing, it is something which we can do outside of the academic classroom, as it were. A lot of the expert roundtables that we run are about bringing together academic expertise and evidence, policymakers, practitioners in local government, sometimes, as Amanda said, people with lived experience of the issue, and really kind of trying to tease out what is the issue, what's worked elsewhere, what could work here in Wales, what do we have the delivery capacity for. And so we do that sort of thing. IWA does some of that, Bevan do it too. There are some forums in which that happens, but I don't think there are as many here in Wales as you'd have, for example, if you went to London, where there are think tanks on every other street corner. So there is much more that we could do to build up that infrastructure. And I think your podcast is part of that, of course, as well. Some of this has gone virtual rather than physical, and that's really good. The other thing that I think we could do is try and create much more reflective practice and practitioners. So we try and reflect all the time on what we're doing. What did we get right? What did we not get right? What do we learn for the next piece of work that we do? And part of that compression of time and headspace that Dan and I are both talking about, I think means sometimes there isn't time for policymakers to mentor one another in that way, and to take a little breath and think, so what's gone right about this policy, and what hasn't, and what do we take forward? So learning on the job, I think, is as valuable as sitting in a classroom with a Cardiff University professor, but that's constantly being squeezed out by the day job, and we need to somehow try and make that part of the day job.
No, I think you've exemplified a lot of what I thought of that particular course. It was sitting with people from across the Welsh public sector, fire service, police, health, wider afield was really, really good. And I was also fortunate enough to go to a course recently within the health service, and there were 3 distinct parts of the health service who were only in this particular course speaking to each other for the first time, and you could see the benefits of breaking out of that day job area and seeing how others you're supposed to work with work. So I think there's a lot in that and how we can do it, but it's like you said, it's that time away from the day job. I am coming to the end, but Dan, Amanda, on that aspect about how we upskill our policy workforce and address some of the issues which has come out of the COVID inquiry, which perhaps we were aware of before. Have you got any other thoughts?
I'm just going to pick up on something Amanda said about implementation, because it is something that I'm too obsessed with and interested in. But one of the things that came through from the COVID inquiry is who gets listened to. I've seen sometimes policymakers at all levels be unfocused in the way in which that they do that. So how do you use your stakeholder engagement or your co-productive activities in order to build the picture that you need to do, gather the intelligence you need to gather in order to make a better policy than the one you would if you just were sat in the Bay or sat in Westminster and designing it yourselves, when there's all sorts of biases that come through because you only ever see part of the world. I think some tendance to the implementation in the policy design process and thinking about who is involved and how you bring in voices that aren't directly involved is something that I think could do with a bit more attention, actually, in terms of the skill set available to policymakers.
Amanda, I don't know if you want to mention that. I have got a part of that is something, one of the key aspects in policy for me is the evaluation aspect of it and how that's used, whether it's built in, and then how the policies, a lot of what you've talked about, how they're monitored going forward and addressed and changed. Could talk about the single-use carrier bag charge and how Wales is still the same charge what it was when we introduced it, and the other parts of the UK are different now. And I'm wondering on the evaluation, but have you got any aspects on that side of things you'd like to contribute?
On the question so I'll come back to that one if that's okay and try and weave them all together. But I think kind of connected to what Dan was saying about kind of implementation and who you listen to and how we listen to different voices, and how we use that to improve kind of policy making capacity. I think there's something about creating processes and infrastructures that enable policymakers to understand other people's experiences from across, both in terms of service users and public service deliverers. And so I've always been a fan of the system that they have in some countries. I think in Iceland, where policymakers and officials spend some time working directly in the public services that their decisions affect. So, a year in working in a school or working in a hospital. And I think that really can help decision makers to understand the experiences of the people who, both kind of the professionals and the service users, who their decisions will affect. And then I think that I wanted to kind of follow up on the question you asked, Dan, at the very beginning about kind of why is policy important and what is policy? And I think that we're in a position today in Wales and the UK and kind of probably across the world where we actually kind of need to continue to make the case that government policy and public services and the public sector is an entity that can create the change we want to see in society, and that it is a sort of locus of change, because there are some that would argue that that's not where change can come from. And of course, change can come from other sectors as well and other entities in society. But I do think it's important to defend the principle that the public sector and governments are a key way in which we as societies and communities writ large can create change. And that links back to your evaluation point, Kerry, because in order to make that case effectively, we need to actually demonstrate that government policies, interventions, programmes do create the change. But of course, the thing with evaluations are that they're often very hard to do really well. You can't always put a randomised control trial around every policy, because sometimes it's just not ethical or it's too expensive. And generally, evaluations are very, very resource intensive, so we can't afford to put them in place in all of the instances that we'd want to. So I completely agree that it's really, really important for all the reasons I've said, but that there are key challenges there that we need to work through.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair to say it's about getting the balance and the compromises for these things. But I know in some areas I've worked in, I would have liked the predecessor schemes to have had a good evaluation to set you on a good stance. So I do want to ask you a final kind of policy landscape in Wales question. We've talked through better training for policymakers, awareness. We've also mentioned silos. That's a big thing for me, that we need a far more holistic approach across government departments and across the wider public sector. But can each of you perhaps just give me, in a short, snappy Christmas wish list kind of way, one key aspect to improve our policy-making landscape in Wales may be?
It's a really great question. So what do policymakers want for Christmas? Well, some obvious things, I guess. If Santa has £900 million, that would be great for Wales. So more money, if we're kind of wishing for a moment. More realistically, I think an uneventful 2024, which again won't happen, but it would be really great if we don't have a pandemic or a major kind of event like Brexit. We're going to have a general election, I guess, but we kind of all think we know what's going to happen there. So some time to deal with the longer term issues, which don't change in spite of all of these other events, to quote a former Prime Minister, would be really good. And what will be top of my list there is to think about the way in which we get out of this spiral where in 20 years' time, all public spending will have to be devoted to healthcare because of the ageing of the population, and there won't be anything left for anything. We just can't go on like that. And that requires some really courageous and imaginative thinking, public engagement, and a real effort to think about how do we improve the health of the nation so that we don't just spend all of our time treating those of us who fall ill or for a variety of reasons can't engage in mainstream society. At some point, we're going to have to deal with that issue. So maybe 2024 would be a good time to start thinking about it.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting one. Dan, can you top Steve's wish list?
No, I want Steve's wish list to come true. The one that immediately came into my mind was that I get frustrated by, and I know I'm only adding my name to an already very long list, I get frustrated by the kind of cluttered landscape in Wales, just the number of regional collaborations that are on various footings, either statutory footings or driven by funding or another policy initiative that creates another structure. But what we've got is lots and lots and lots of multi-agency partnerships, and they have overlapping remits, and people spend a disproportionate amount of their time going to these things, and they're all well-intentioned, and nobody wants to grasp the nettle and do something about it and clear out some of that, because I think some of it does need to be cleared out. I don't think anybody would thank me for putting that on their agenda, to be honest. There's just a lack of will, I think, to do what's seen as very difficult, very controversial, and nobody has an easy answer to it.
For those who listen to the pod, what you just expressed is what comes out quite regularly. The pod we published today, which was us talking, summarising the autumn political updates, very much again looking at that kind of approach to governance, engagement, rationalisation in Wales. So, I think it's a common theme. But Amanda, you get the final word. What would you do to improve our kind of policy landscape?
I also hope that Steve's wish list comes true, but kind of if I'm answering the question on the basis of what is within the control of sort of the Welsh public sector, like Dan's suggestion, there are certain things that come up in the key recommendations of almost every report we write and like almost every project we work on, and as well as effective collaboration and partnership working coming up as a solution to almost every policy challenge. Another thing that comes up in almost every project is data. and kind of, you can envisage a world in which the Welsh public sector much more effectively collects and shares data and information to enable the whole public sector to effectively understand the issues we're trying to improve and address, and helps us to understand how far our efforts are achieving those intended outcomes, and to ultimately improve the delivery of public services and interventions and policies. And I think there is like real potential for change there. You know, we see it in the private sector. The private sector much more effectively collects, uses, shares information and data to their own ends. And I think there's huge scope for government, including in Wales, to kind of make progress on that front. And I think that would then set us up for actually in the future more effectively using AI and large language models to use that data to then kind of generate enhanced insights and action. So that would be on my wish list.
No, that's great. And I did have a question on AI, but sadly we're out of time, because I think AI could be a bit of a game changer in a lot of ways. But we have run out of time. So I do thank you all for joining us today. We always ask guests, because people, I'm sure, are interested in your work and might want to get in touch with you. So we ask you if you can by social media means. Steve, is there a way for people to contact you if they want to hear more?
Yeah, probably the best way is through our website, old-fashioned, but we're on Twitter as well. But everything that we produce is freely available on our website, and you can get in touch with one of us or Liz, our comms officer.
Dan, have you got a personal, if people want to engage with you or see what you're working on, how can they contact you?
I'm on X, formerly Twitter, and at DW Bristow, if people want to track me down. But similarly, my contact details are on the website if people want to find me.
And Amanda, I'm sure you're on the website as well, but if people wanted to see your kind of wider thoughts and musings on social media, is there a way?
I'm also on X and LinkedIn at Amanda Hill-Dixon.
We shall. Hopefully you'll pick up a few followers to see what you're talking about. But can I once again thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It is hugely appreciated. And thank you for the work you've done over the past 10 years. You know, it's the hidden stuff which doesn't really get looked at, but as a civil servant for a long time, it helped me out, and the very best for the next 10 years. And hopefully when we next do this, the policy landscape will be quite different. Thanks again.
Thanks, Gary. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, then you can find more from Hiraeth on the various podcast apps. We are on all the socials at Hiraeth Pod, and if you want to support us with your wallet as well as your ears, you can do so from just £3 a month at patreon.com/HiraethPod.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.